He ran as fast as he could, with the wind fighting against his body. His bare feet hitting the wet ground, he fell. The shouts grew closer, the dogs louder. Fear seized him. The fright seeped into his bones. His heart pounded through his chest. His thoughts were the last of everything that mattered. In a flash was life. At the end, a blow to the head. They all took turns until he was paralyzed by the pain. Then he was lifted, the tightness around his neck breaking everything in it, the breath violently stolen from him. The crowd grew larger. The bonfire was lit. Laughter was in the air. People joked as they passed around the man's body parts. Some were put in jars, pieces of a human trophy that would later be put on display. Children giggled as flies fed on the blood that dripped down the man's disfigured face. This was entertainment along the countryside for families, mothers, fathers, and even small children. A show of the dead nigger swinging from a tree. This was a human being, a man who had a life, falsely accused like so many others. No one came to save him. What happened to him was a story that was untold, buried in the ground, until one courageous woman decided to expose the horrors of lynchings. This woman was Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi on July 16, 1862, during the Civil War, less than a year before emancipation. She grew up during Reconstruction, the period when black men, including her father, were able to vote, ushering black representatives into state legislatures across the South. As one of 8 siblings, she often tagged along to Bible school on her mother's hip. In 1878, her parents both died of yellow fever, along with one of her brothers, and at 16, she took on caring for the rest of her siblings. She supported them by working as a teacher after dropping out of high school and lying about her age. She finished her own education at night and on weekends. Around the same time, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was largely nullified by the Supreme Court, reversing many of the advancements of the Reconstruction. The anti-black sentiment that grew around her was ultimately codified into Jim Crow. It felt like dramatic whiplash, said Troy Dustard, Wells' grandson, who is a sociology professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and New York University. She cuts her teeth politically in this time of justice, 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 and then injustice. Observing the changes around her, Wells decided to become a journalist during what was a golden era for black writers and editors. Her goal was to write about black people for black people in a way that was accessible to those who, like her, were born the property of white owners and had much to defend. Her articles were often reprinted abroad and in more than 200 black weeklies then in circulation in the United States. At 21, Wells clashed with a white train conductor who ordered her to move from the ladies' car, the car reserved for white women, to the section designated for black passengers, despite her having brought a first-class ticket. When she refused, the conductor tried to forcibly move her. Wells fastened her teeth on the back of his hand, as she wrote later. She sued the railroad after being ejected from the train and won the case. A newspaper headline declared, "Darky Damsel Gets Damages." But later she lost on appeal before the Tennessee Supreme Court, after which she urged black Americans to avoid the trains and later to leave the South entirely. She also traveled to Britain to rally her cause, encouraging the British to stop purchasing American cotton and angering many white Southern business owners. By the time she turned 25, she was a co-owner and editor of the Free Speech and Headlight, a local black newspaper, a platform she used to skewer racial inequality. Then came the People's Grocery lynching. She denounced it in print, armed herself with a pistol, and spent months traveling alone in the South researching more than 700 lynchings from the previous decade. In a time of extreme racism, yellow journalism, and biased reporting, documenting and speaking the truth about lynchings in the South was a rare and very dangerous act. But that did not stop Ida. When one of her friends was lynched in Memphis in 1892, she decided she could not let the defamation and murder of Black American men stand any longer. For months, Wells traveled throughout the South investigating lynchings. She used eyewitness interviews, testimony from families, and looked through records. The New York Times, in its recent obituary for Wells, noted, "She pioneered reporting techniques that remain central tenets of modern journalism." Over 4,000 Black Americans were lynched in 12 southern states between 1877 and 1950, according to the Equal Justice Initiative's 2015 report, Lynching in America. Some were witnessed by big crowds who brought children in picnic baskets, as if at public entertainment. Wells's great-granddaughter, Michelle Duster, an author and public speaker, said, "They would torture people before they were killed and dismember them afterwards and pass around the body parts. It was shocking to me that people would take bones as souvenirs. The more I learned about the level of violence, the more I appreciated what it took for her to do what she did. I am just amazed." Wells visited places where people had been hanged, shot, beaten, burned alive, drowned, or mutilated. She examined photos of victims hanging from trees as mobs looked on, pored over local newspaper accounts, took sworn statements from eyewitnesses, and, on occasion, even hired private investigators. It was astounding, courageous work in an era of Jim Crow segregation and in which women did not have the vote. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who writes for the New York Times Magazine, said, "There was no protection from the law for a Black woman who was going into territories where Black people had been stolen from jail and lynched with the help of law enforcement. These places would have been hostile to a Black person questioning these communities at all. But think about the types of emotion in a community that has just lynched someone and strung up their body for public display, and then to have a Black woman come in there asking questions. One has to ask, would I have the courage to do that? There was no help that was going to come for you. There was no protection from the law. Black folks didn't even have a lot of legal rights, and they certainly didn't have much protection from law enforcement." Wells, however, was a force of nature who once said, "One had better die fighting injustice than die like a dog or a rat in a trap." On another occasion, she wrote, "I had already determined to sell my life as dearly as possible if attacked. If I could take one lyncher with me, this would even up the score a little bit." She destroyed the mainstream media's narrative that suggested lynching victims were criminals, often sexually assaulting white women, and they got what they deserved. Her reporting showed that the sexual assault had not been alleged in 2/3 of the lynchings, or was only alleged after a covert consensual interracial relationship had been exposed. She's putting names to stories and names to statistics. She was putting context into what was happening. Without what she did, it was pretty much okay. This person committed a crime. They got what they deserved. She said, no, they did not commit a crime. The narrative of the mainstream media at this time was very different from the reality she found on the ground. Much like the killing of Black people by police today, the official story of lynchings was just largely accepted, which was that Black men were predators and that unknown vigilantes were just meting out justice to the Black brutes. You can look at the way the newspaper covered these things, that it was just accepted, and Ida B. Wells exposed the reality behind lynchings, which was that they were often used as economic retaliation. They were used to sow fear in Black communities so that Black people would stay in their place, and she exposed the truth about that. She also exposed that while law enforcement would often say these lynchings occur at the hands of parties unknown, everyone in town knew who committed them and often law enforcement took part. Wells published her findings in a series of fiery editorials in the newspaper she co-owned and edited, the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight. The public, it turned out, was starved for her stories and devoured them voraciously. The Journalist, a mainstream trade publication that covered the media, named her the Princess of the Press. Readers of her work were drawn in by her fine-toothed reporting methods and language that, even by today's standards, was aberrantly bold. There was no word equal to it in convincing power, Frederick Douglass wrote to her in a letter that hatched their friendship. I have spoken, but my word is feeble in comparison, he added. He was referring to the writing like the kind she published in the Free Speech in May of 1892. Nobody in this section of the country believes the threadbare old lie that Negro men rape white women, Wells wrote. Instead, Wells saw lynchings as a form of subjugation, an excuse to get rid of the Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized and the nigger down, she wrote in her journal. Whenever possible, Wells named the victims of racist violence and told their stories. In her journals, she lamented that her subjects would have otherwise been forgotten by all. Save the night wind, no memorial service to bemoan their sad and horrible fate, she wrote. Wells also organized economic boycotts long before the tactic was popularized by other, mostly male civil rights activists who are often credited for its success. Wells was as fierce in conversation as she was in her writing, which made it difficult for her to maintain close relationships, according to her family. She criticized people, including friends and allies, whom she saw as weak in their commitment to the causes she cared about. She didn't suffer fools, and she saw fools everywhere, Duster, her grandson, said. One exception was her husband and closest confidant, Ferdinand L. Barnett, a widower who was a lawyer and civil rights activist in Chicago. After they married in 1895, Barnett's activism took a back seat to his wife's career. Theirs was an atypically modern relationship, uncommon for the time. Ida hyphenated her name rather than take his. The couple had 4 children. Wells juggled motherhood, journalism, and civil rights. He cooked dinner for the children most nights, and he cared for them while she traveled to make speeches and organize. Wells continued to face danger and opposition as she began to tell her story across the country. Wells continued her reporting, writing for the New York Age, the Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean, the Conservator, and many other newspapers. She published the pamphlet Southern Horrors later in 1892, working off of what she had written for the Age and providing additional details. She then traveled across Europe, gaining support there for her anti-lynching mission. Her success in Europe emboldened her efforts once she returned to the U.S. and continued lecturing and writing. While Wells was out of town, a mob destroyed her printing press in Memphis and threatened to kill her if she returned. She stayed away from the South for more than 3 decades, but toured the U.S. and the UK, raising awareness through public speaking. In 1895, she published a pamphlet, The Red Record, the first statistical record of the history of American lynchings, a forerunner of data journalism projects such as The Counted, the Guardian's project to document people killed by the police. In 1909, she was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known as the NAACP. She was later ousted because she was perceived as too radical. She also worked with Susan B. Anthony as a leader in the movement for women's suffrage. Later in life, Wells fell from prominence and was replaced by activists like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. They were more conservative in their tactics, thus had more support from the white and black establishments. During the final years of her life living in Chicago, Wells ran for the Illinois State Senate, but lost abysmally. Despite her ebbing influence, she continued to organize around causes such as mass incarceration, working several years as a probation officer, until she died of kidney disease on March 25, 1931, at the age of 68. I think her being a woman and a black woman were the things that pretty much guaranteed her obscurity. She was also written out of the suffrage movement, even though she played a huge role in it, and was trying to push the white suffragists on racial equality. Both her gender and her race are the reasons why she was largely written out of history, Hannah Jones said. But now she's inspiring a new generation of women in journalism. Nicole Hannah Jones is the co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting, which aims to increase the ranks, retention, and profile of reporters and editors of color in the field. Wells was threatened physically and rhetorically constantly throughout her career. She was called a harlot and courtesan for her frankness, but her commitment to chronicling the experience of Black Americans in order to demonstrate their humanity remained unflinching. If this work can contribute in any way toward proving this, and at the same time arouse the conscience of the American people to demand justice to every citizen and punishment by law for the lawlessness, I shall feel I have done my race a service, Ida B. Wells wrote. Of her awards and accomplishments, in 1889, Ida B. Wells became part owner of the Free Speech, a Memphis newspaper. According to Michelle Duster's book, Ida B. the Queen, that made her one of the few Black women in the country at the time to be both owner and editor of a newspaper. In 1896, she co-founded the National Association of Colored Women. In 1897, she established the first Black kindergarten in Chicago. In 1908, she founded the Negro Fellowship League, one of the first Black settlement houses in Chicago. In 1909, she co-founded the NAACP, although she was excluded from the list of co-founders. In 1913, she co-founded the Alfred Suffrage Club, the first Black women's suffrage organization in Chicago. The club helped elect Oscar DePriest, the first Black alderman in Chicago. Also in 1913, she integrated the suffrage march in Washington, D.C., despite being asked to march in the back. In 2018, Congress Parkway was officially renamed Ida B. Wells Drive, becoming the first downtown street to be named for a Black woman. The street signs displaying her name went up in 2019. In 2020, she was awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize and a special citation in awards category. Ida B. Wells is considered by historians to have been the most well-known and influential Black women in the United States during her lifetime. She pioneered reporting techniques that are now used in journalism today. And as a former slave who stood less than 5 feet tall, she took on structural racism more than half a century before her strategies were repurposed, often without crediting her during the 1960s civil rights movement. Her remarkable courage, unwavering determination, admirable strength, and leadership establishes her as one of the most important people in the 20th century. Ida B. Wells, Onyx Queen. If you enjoyed this video, please share, like, and subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching.